Nesiya Ada, these are leaders of the community. Kriya Moed, called for meetings. Anshe Shem, these are men of name. What do? Vayikal al Moshe v'Aaron, they gather against Moshe and Aaron, and they say to them, Rav lachem, enough for yourself. You've taken too much. Ki kol ha'eda kulam kadoshim u'v'soichem Hashem u'madua tisnaso al kal Hashem. Why do you lord yourself over the community of God? There are a number of questions here, but first of all, let's look at Rashi. So Rashi says, Vayikach Korach. What did Korach do? Lokach es atzmoi letzad echad. He took himself to the side. Lios nechlak mitocha eda, to separate himself from the rest of the community, to stir against the kahuna. And v'zer shotigim unkelos. Unkelos translates it v'ispeleg. Ispeleg means he separated himself. He separated from the rest of the community to be machzik in the machlokes. And then Rashi brings a few psukim from Tanakh, from the book of Eov, from the book of Vayikra, Hosea, where kach means to take with words, or to take, if you like, separate yourself. Fine. Let's look at another Rashi on the Ben Yitzhak ben Kos ben Levi. Says Rashi, it mentions the son of Yitzhak, the son of Kos, the son of Levi, but it stops at Levi, v'lo hizkir ben Yaakov. It does not mention the son of Yaakov. Why not? Shebikesh rachamim al atzmoi, Yaakov begged for rachmanas. Shelo yizocher shmoi al machlakusam. I don't want my name. He doesn't want his name mentioned in the machlokes. Where do we see that? Shenamar, as it says, bikaholom al techad kavoidi. When they gather, don't put my name there. Al techad kavoidi. And those words are the words in which Yaakov Avinu prays as he gives the blessing to Shimon and Levi, and he says, when they gather, don't put my name there. V'heicha nizkar shmol Korach. Where's Yaakov happy to have his name with Korach? Says Rashi, behisyachsom al haduchan. When they are traced to the platform as they stood there singing. And there we find him in the Divrei Hayomim, the Pasuk, Ben Avi Yosef, Ben Korach, Ben Yitzhak, Ben Kos, Ben Levi, and then Ben Yisrael. There, Yisrael, of course, is Yaakov, and there is happy to have his name mentioned. And what needs to be understood is, whilst Rashi tells us that Yaakov prayed and prayed, he was Mavakesh Rachmim, don't have my name mentioned in the machlokes, what we need to know is why. Why does Yaakov daven and pray that his name should not be in the machlokes? Now, you could look at it very superficially, and you could say, what is the word used by Yaakov to denote his or to indicate his name? It's kavoidi, my honor. So if we're looking at it very superficially, it looks like Yaakov is concerned about his kavod, his honor. I don't want my name in that terrible machlokes, that disastrous machlokes. Don't put my name there. But to say that sounds very strange. Or to put it in another way, what is Yaakov really saying? Is he saying, I don't want my name there. Please don't put my name in the shmutz. Yeah, my son Levi, he can be there. My grandson Kahos, he can be there. My great-grandson Yitzhak, he can be there. Oh, but don't put my name there. Chas v'shalom to think that way. Yaakov Avinu was worried about his kavod, and that's the only reason he doesn't want his name there. This, therefore, brought and gave rise to a number of different explanations as to what does that really mean. Yaakov says, don't put my name in the machlokes. Let's have a look at a few of the different commentaries. I want to look first at some more modern commentaries, and then we'll go back in time to the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. Maram Shapiro, the Lubliner Rav, passing away in the 1930s, gives the following explanation. He brings a Al-Shich HaKadosh on the Teichacha of B'chukoisai, where there, towards the end of the Teichacha, towards the end of the rebuke, we find the Pasuk says, V'zacharti esbrisi Yaakov, esbrisi Avraham, etc., etc. It talks about how Hashem says, I will remember Yaakov, my bris with Yaakov and Yitzchak and Avraham. And there is a difference of opinion as to whether that forms part of the rebuke or is that already part of the comforting words. It's a machlokes, generally speaking, it's seen as comforting. And therefore, in most shuls today, when they read those words, they lift their voices. The Baal Korah, who's been rather quiet reading the Tochacha, lifts his voice somewhat at the Zachartis Bris. Why? Because it's an uplifting part. God says, I will remember my bris with Yaakov, etc., etc. However, not all agree. The Shla Kodesh, for example, and the Al-Shicha Kodesh maintained that these words are actually part of the rebuke. How are they part of the rebuke? Because what Hashem is really saying is, I look at you, Klal Yisrael, and I see you sink into the quagmire of Averis, of sins. And I start thinking to myself, Hashem, so to speak, Hashem says, Oi, I remember my bris with Yaakov, with Abraham, with Yitzchak. I remember these amazing four ancestors. I think about the background that you had. Such amazing, so to speak. Look at the mountains. Look at what you were formed upon. And what happened to you? How could you do that? How could you be doing what you've done? In other words, according to the Al-Shicha Kodesh, and as I said, the Shla Kodesh and others, these words mentioning the Oves is not always going to be of help. Says the Maram Shapiro, what do we see from this is that at times saying the Ovos' name, bringing them to mention, actually is a disservice. Actually will not help. It actually goes against us. Why? Because if it's mentioning the Ovid, saying, well, where are we? We come from that nation. We come from that amazing background. What happened to us? Says Maram Shapiro, Yaakov Avinu says, please don't put my name there. I don't want my name there. Why? Because if my name is going to be mentioned in the machlokes of Korach, it's only going to backfire. It's only going to look worse. It's going to be like, Korach, you came from such a man of Yaakov. Yaakov, who was such a man of peace, a man of Shalom, Oyeshav Oilim, one of the three Ovis, one of the three pillars. How could you stoop to such a thing? Yaakov says it's not going to help. It's going to make things worse by putting my name there. That's how the Ram Shapiro of Lublin looks. Then we have the Chidush Harim. Fascinating answer also. The Chidush Harim says in the insight, why is it that Yaakov Avinu is davening that I don't want my name to be mentioned on the machlokes? He says for the following reason. Yaakov Avinu is a nefesh, is a special soul, what we call a neshama klolis. He's a nasi. In fact, the word nasi can even stand for, he doesn't say this, but we know this, nasi stands for, or can stand for, nitzutz shel Yaakov Avinu. He is a person who includes all neshamas. Yaakov Avinu davened and he prayed. He said, Hashem, let that Avera, let that rebellion of Korach not go past Levi. Let it not reach me. Because if it reaches me, then even I can't help them. The pagam, the blemish of the machlokes, of this fight of Korach, could be so severe that if it affects me, if it reaches me, then even I can't pray for you. I can't even help you. As he puts it, as I put it there in just in a one-liner there, Yaakov yochel levakesh rachamim. Yaakov can ask for rachamim. Im loy ma'arbe b'moisai. If you don't mix him in. In Yiddish we say, mishmanish arayin, don't mix me into your machlokes, then I as the leader, I as the Rebbe, I can help you. But if you mix me in your machlokes, then even I can't help you. Let's have a look, however, at yet a third way of understanding this, and this is from the Arachaim HaKodesh. The Arachaim is quite long, and we'll see how far we can get through this. He brings two different biurim, two different explanations, but he asks a number of questions in addition to this question about Yaakov's name being absent. Let's have a look at the four major questions that he raises here. Number one, the question that everyone asks, that Rashi dealt with as well. Vayikach Korach, Tzorich Ladas, Omre Korach. What does it mean by Yikach? What does he take exactly? It says a verb, but it doesn't have the object of it. Now Chazal say he took himself to the side. That's fine. But grammatically, says the Arachaim HaKodesh, we're lacking the word atzmoi. We're lacking the word himself. It doesn't say Korach took himself. It doesn't say Vayikach Korach oisoi. It says Korach was the active arguer. But what's missing is, who did he take? Who was the Rechlak? You want to answer that it was like the Unclus translates, the Ispaleg, which means he split himself. That's not the same as Vayikach Korach. Vayikach means active. He took. Ispeleg is a hitpael. It's a reflexive form of the verb. That would mean he was taken. Yes, the Targum does translate what the meaning is, but it's not the actual grammar. It doesn't fit into the grammar. And therefore, the Orach HaKodesh says, the Eibishter gives us other words. Let's see if we can get another explanation on Vayikach. What exactly did he take? Is the object mentioned in the pasuk? Number two. The second question we need to understand is how Hashem does not mention together with why did Hashem mention the tzaddikim, Yitzhar, Kahos, and Levi in such a terrible story? Now, when you think about it, we remind ourselves of a famous Rashi, a Chazal, that says that when a man is associated with in a bad deed with other people, it reflects on them as well. And often we say that he's a Rasha, and the father was a Rasha, and the grandfather was a Rasha, etc. This cannot be the case here, says the Orach HaKodesh. The father of Korach was a tzaddik, Yitzhar. He was the second oldest brother of Amram. Kahos was a tzaddik. Levi was a tzaddik. And yet, why on earth does Hashem mention these tzaddikim in connection with Korach? Lama, ma tzarech b'yesh b'daba. What reason would there be for this? Now, Chazal actually say that Yaakov davened for himself, and he said, Hashem, don't put my name there. Mashma, that seems to imply that Yaakov's name really should have been there as well. I'm astonished, says the Orach HaKodesh. Even the ones that I mentioned, I'm astonished about. Why on earth are Chazal asking and saying, oh, why is Yaakov's name not mentioned? Asks the Orach HaKodesh, I would ask the opposite. Why the others are mentioned? Why mention Yitzhar and Kahos and Levi? Or maybe mention Yitzhar, maybe the father. But the grandfather and the great-grandfather, who are all tzaddikim, why mention them? Number three, the third question. The Torah says the words, Vadosan va'aviram, and Korach took, and then it says, and Dosan and Aviram. What exactly did they do? Ma saying. If it's to say that they also argued, then it should have agreed that they were also taking the argument, or they also took part in the argument. It should have said Vayikchu, and they, Korach and Dosan and Aviram, all together took. But since it says Vayikach singular, the singular expression, then it cannot mean that Dosan and Aviram are taking. Are you going to say it means, well, maybe Korach took them? If Korach took them, then we have a problem with the letter Vav. It should have said Vayikach Korach Dosan and Aviram, not V'Dosan and Aviram. That Vav in front of V'Dosan and Aviram tells us that they did something also. Let's have a look at the fourth question. To understand the fourth question, let's go back in the Psukim and look inside the Psukim again. In the yellow highlighted, we see the Psukim. It says that in the second pasuk, Vayokumu, and they stood in front of Moshe. And there were people of the Jewish people, 250 of them, leaders of the community, all called to meetings, men of name. Then we have Vayikalu, and they gathered against Moshe and Aaron, and they said, Rav lachem, enough for yourself. What is this first Vayokumu? What are those three words doing? And they stood before Moshe. Who stood? And what did they do when they were standing? Let's have a look at the Orach HaKodesh as he expresses this. In the fourth question, Vayokumu lifnei Moshe ma yagid hakosav v'kimazu, what is the Torah telling us with this stand? What did they do? Im loimar, if it's to tell you that they also came to argue, well, that appears later on in the pasuk when it says Vayikalu, and they gathered and they said, etc., etc. Are you going to say they just stood defiantly in front of him in chutzpah, just stand up, making a stand? Then it should have said Vayokumu after the words Vayikalu, after they gathered. They haven't yet gathered. So what do you mean Vayikalu, Vayokumu, Vayomru? V'lama hifsik, why is he separating between Vayokumu and Vayikalu, standing up and gathering with, and the 250 men? All of a sudden, the 250 men are in between there. To answer all these questions, the Orach HaKodesh has a fascinating insight as to what exactly did Korach take. The Pasuk wants to tell us the basis of this machlokes. And that is as follows. There is a question that is nagging at the core of the issue. Where does a man get the chutzpah to stand up against a novi who is Naaman, who is faithful, Ashet Sodkun Vasai, whose prophecy has proved time and time again to be accurate, and Korach was a chacham. He was a Chazal call him a pikayach. How could he have such a shtus to do such a thing? Now Rashi asks this question as well, but the Ohr HaChaim asks it from a different angle. He's not saying what got him to. How could he think he was right? He was what the Ohr HaChaim is asking as, it's a different question. Isn't it suicide? Wouldn't all the Jewish people stone him to death if you dared open your mouth against the man of God, Ish Elokim Moshe Rabbeinu? How could he even think of doing it? This is being answered, says the Ohr HaChaim, in the very opening pasuk, in the words of Vayikach Korach. Lazeh, therefore, says the Ohr HaChaim, Amar hataimim shelokach b'daitu lavoi beriv. The pasuk is expressing what are the reasons that Yaakov has to enter this quarrel, to enter this terrible, terrible machlokes. Rishona, the first thing the Torah tells us is Ben Yitzhar. I come from Yitzhar. What do you mean he comes from Yitzhar? Yitzhar was the oldest of the two brothers, older than the other two brothers who come after him among the children of Gahas. And therefore, the other two siblings, namely Chevron and Uziel, would not be able to do anything. He would be able to machzif. He'd be able to stand defiantly in front of them because he was older than them. They would close their mouths in front of their older brother. So once you've silenced Chevron and Uziel, so that takes care of not only Chevron and Uziel, but all their children as well, including Elitzophan, the son of Uziel. But that's not good enough. Says the pasuk Ben Kahos. He also takes the child, the facts that he is the child of Kahos or grandson of Kahos. Who was Kahos? Kahos was one of three children of Levi, Gershon, Kos, and Merari. But of the three, he was the greatest. They were the carrying of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. We learned earlier on in the Parsha of Bamidbar and Nosai how the children of Kahos were carrying the holiest of articles. And Chazal say further, of the children of Kahos, who was the one that came from them that actually carried the Aron? It was Korach himself. Korach hoyo minoise Aron hoyo, one of the carriers of Aron. And as soon as you know that he is from the children of Kahos, then the children of Merari and Gershon would not speak out against him. So he's already taken care of that part of the family. He's taken care of his uncles. He's taken care of his brothers of his grandfather, Gershon and Merari, and all their descendants. But then he needs to show how he is stronger, if you like, even than the rest of Klal Yisrael, Ben Levi. Why does he say Ben Levi? Because of all the tribes of Israel, it was the tribe of Levi that had the spotless reputation. They were the top class. And because he came from Levi, the other Shvatim would not be able to take him out with their words. They would not be able to stop him in front of Moshe. Kimu ulahu mikol Shvatim. Levi was the top of all the tribes. And within Levi, he was from the Anfei Kahos, coming from Kahos. Within Kahos, he comes from Yitzhar, which is greater than the other two brothers, Chevron and Uziel. He therefore felt very confident to stand up. And this, says the Ohr HaChaim, is answering that underlying question, how could he even dare to open his mouth against Moshe? Why wasn't he afraid of the backlash of the rest of Klal Yisrael? Now, by doing so, we've also explained, the Ohr HaChaim has also explained, although he doesn't spell it out, why it didn't say Ben Yaakov. Why it didn't say Ben Yaakov is for obvious reasons. There's no way that saying that you are the son of Yaakov or descendant of Yaakov, that doesn't give you any preference over any other people and any other Klal Yisrael. Because Klal Yisrael comes from Yaakov. The whole Jewish people come from Yaakov. Everybody, all the tribes. So it would be pointless of Korach taking his yichus, his genealogy, the fact that he is the son of Yaakov. And therefore it says, Vayikach Korach, what did he take? Ben Yitzhar, Ben Kos, Ben Levi, because that served his purpose. If that's the case, says the Ohr HaChaim, we now understand what the next few words are. v'doson v'aviram. V'oimrei v'doson v'aviram. Why does it say and doson aviram? Pirish gamoisam lakach. He takes them as well. Why? Because now he wants to take and say, you know what? You guys coming from doson aviram, you are the heads of the tribe of Reuven. Reuven is not a small thing. Reuven is the Bechoyer, the eldest of all the children of Yaakov. And with that, by means of that, he wants to give them that importance. Vayokumu lifnei Moshe. They stand before Moshe. But what do they do? They're not rebelling at this time. But what are they doing? What's up with that stand in front of Moshe? It says the Racham HaKodesh, they're standing there to show that they are equal. Bahashva im Moshe. Korach, for the reason we said, he comes from wonderful pedigree. Dosan Aviram, they come from the tribe of Reuven, which is the godel of all the tribes, and Gam Milevi. But this stand of being hashva, of saying that I'm at the same level as Moshe, they couldn't say, he couldn't say that for the 250 men. Yes, there were 250 men that joined in, but they were not vayokumu lifnei Moshe. They did not stand in front of Moshe. But what did they come for? Va'anoshim pirish gamela, all the Sodis he took with him. Because they were Gedolei Yisrael. They're the ones who are going to help him now. But Elu loy bo'u legadazeh. There's no way that they could reach the level to stand before Moshe. They just assembled to strengthen the words of Korach and his men. For that reason, it says, Vayakumu, they stood before it even mentions the 250 men. And with this nisyash v'kol ha'dikdukim, this answers all the questions that we've had so far. This is one explanation of how the Racham HaKodesh explains why the Ben Yitzhar, Ben Kos, Ben Levi, etc. However, there is a further way of understanding this. And this is based on Chazal. Oid Yispar, says the Racham HaKodesh. We'll look at it a bit further, based on what our rabbis tell us, that the main machlokas of Korach, what really set him off, more than anything else in the world, what really set him off was the appointment of Elitzophan, the son of Uziel. The appointment of Elitzophan, the son of Uziel, who Moshe had given the privilege of being the Nasi. And the Pasuk is telling us that Korach took a whole lot of contradictions, and he says, Moshe Rabbeinu, you are contradicting yourself. What did he mean? First of all, he says, you know, I'm the son of Yitzhar. What are you really out to get? Do you give preference to the oldest of the children? Is that why you've given the kahuna to Aaron? Because he is coming from Amram, Amram being the oldest of the four siblings, Amram, Yitzhar, and Uziel. Well, if that's the case, by virtue of that, for that very reason, I should become the Nasi, I should become the leader of Levi, being the son of the second child, Yitzhar. Yitzhar was the second after Amram, Sheni li Amram, who is Ben Kahos, who is the son of Kahos, and that is the same branch from which Aaron came from. And Yitzhar is certainly older than Heber and Uziel. Why have you given the Nasius? Why did you give the leadership to Elitzophan, the son of Uziel? That demonstrates to me, says Korach, that there's no particular preference for being older. It's not the ones who are older that get the jobs. And if that's the case, it's nothing to do with the elder. Im Kain, if that is the case, how could you give the kuna to Aaron? Because Amram was the Bechoyer? That's not true. And now, therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu, your words are contradicted. And therefore, what you've done, I'm suggesting is sheker, chas v'shalom. And the kun of Aaron as well. They're not going to believe him to go after the Hagdovas Amram. The whole tribe of Levi should be equal preference. And therefore, he says, Ben Levi. Korach, however, is a little bit concerned. What's he concerned? Well, maybe his claims won't be accepted other than to annul the appointment of Elitzophan. But what about saying that, Amram before Yitzhar, maybe people won't listen to him. Maybe they'll say that the oldest does get preference after all. Maybe they're not going to listen to that. So what does Yaakov do? Yaakov gets Reuven the Bechoyer, the eldest of all the tribes. And he takes the elders within Reuven, who are Dasan and Avira. And he says, if you are forcing to go after the older one. And that's why you took Aaron, you gave Aaron the older brother and from the oldest sibling of Amram. Then let's go after the firstborn of all the brothers and give him the kahuna. And that's what you did. Now he says, Vayakumu lifnei Moshe, they stand in front of Moshe. What do you mean they stand in front of Moshe? He gets now the children of Reuven, who are the Bechor, as if to say, look, they're the Bechor, but they didn't get a special position, as if to strengthen the contradiction that he's finding. And then after that, he takes the men of the Bnei Israel to therefore also join him in his machlekes as well. And this is basically how the Orach Chaim HaKadosh understands what has happened here. Now, I said before that we mentioned that Korach went against Moshe Rabbeinu, he went against Aaron, but it took a lot of chutzpah to do so. And as we said before, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh gives a reason why he wanted to do that. And that's because of the fact that he could basically cut out 90% of Klal Yisrael from having any go at him because of his prestigious position. Coming from Yitzhar, coming from Kahas, coming from Levi, which cuts out all the rest of Klal Yisrael, so he would basically silence them. But there may be another reason that Korach felt now's the time to act. Now, if there's any time to make a rebellion, this is the time. And this is as based on a famous Ramban, which is quoted in the Kedushas Levi, which we're going to look at now in the next piece. Vayikach Korach ben Yitzhar ben Kos ben Levi. V'hinei haRamban HaKadosh, the holy Ramban, says the Kedushas Levi, writes that the reason that Korach took this point of time to raise and instigate a rebellion, it's because the spies now knew, the generation of the spies knew, that this generation would not enter the land of Israel. And now the honeymoon period between the Jewish people and Moshe is over. That's it. And now for the first time, throughout the whole period of Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership through Egypt, through the exodus of Egypt, and through getting the Torah and Matan Torah and the war against Amalek and everything else, for the first time, the Jewish people have now questions about Moshe. Hirharu achar Moshe. What is this great Moshe? Where's the fruits of it all? We're going to be stuck here in the desert. We're going to die. It's at this point that Korach now feels, now I can act. And for that reason, the Parshas of Korach, etc., follow right after the Meraglim, right after Shlach. Ad kan tochen devarov. Thus far are the words of the Ramban. So according to the Ramban, he says it's not a suicide thing that Korach is doing. He's not going to risk getting stoned to death by the people of Israel because the mood had soured. The honeymoon now was over. That's on the simple level, that's how the Ramban explains it. On a deeper level, however, explains Rabbi Yitzchak Baditchev, who wrote the Kedushas Levi, the following. What was really behind this claim of Korach and the fact that after the Meraglim, after the story of the spies, the Dor HaMidbar, that now he was able to make this rebellion. And that is as follows. The Dor HaMidbar and the generation that entered the land of Israel were different, very, very different from each other, completely different. The Dor HaMidbar, the generation of the desert, and if you look at the word Midbar, it has the same letters as Medaber. These are the generations of the talkers. This is the generation where things went bedibur, by talking. Says the Kedushas Levi, there are tzaddikim who can do things bedibur, with speech, and they don't need any asiyah, they don't need to act. Their word will accomplish what others could do with action. The generation that enters Israel, on the other hand, is a generation that needs action. Tzrichin lasos. They have to do an action. Lasos ezapula. For this reason, when Yehoshua battles with the 31 kings of Canaan, and he has to do an action with the Kidon and the Orev in the book of Yehoshua, as he assembles the people to do the battle against the city of Ai, and he's holding the spear, he's holding the tools of war, and then the people are then asked to fight, and the fight begins. But that's all with action. Moshe Rabbeinu, who was in the generation of the desert, or the Dor HaMedaber, the Dor HaMidbar, doesn't need to do action. He does everything bedibur. He does everything with speech. And one of those examples that we saw is the story in Egypt, where Moshe Rabbeinu sees an Egyptian Ish Mitzri mercilessly belting and beating this Jewish man. And Moshe Rabbeinu, what did he do? He killed him by Yaakov, but he kills him with the word of Hashem. He doesn't need to pick a spear. He doesn't need to pick an ammunition. He looks to and fro and he uses his word, the word of Hashem, and he kills him. Moshe Rabbeinu is in the generation of the Midbar, the Medaber, and he does things bedibur. However, there was a time where even Yehoshua was able to do something with dibur, and that was in the story of Yericho. And now that could be a question. How could Yehoshua conquer Yericho bedibur? And our rabbis tell us that in the Yerushalmi Moed Katan, that the prayer of Aleinu L'Shabeach, which we say every single day, 3 times a day, the Aleinu L'Shabeach was the prayer made by Yehoshua bin Nun as he brings the walls of Jericho down, as they go around the walls of Jericho and he comes down, and they sing the words of Aleinu L'Shabeach. Well, that's clearly a different generation. They're now the generation of action. How does he do that? And here the Kedushas Levi says a fascinating thing. He says, the battle against Jericho was done on Shabbos. And the Arizal writes that the intellect that a person has, a teacher has during the week, his student will have on Shabbos. And therefore, for that reason, what Moshe Rabbeinu could accomplish in the weekday, Yehoshua could do on the Shabbos. Moshe was able to do everything with speech, weekday or Shabbos. But when Yehoshua, his successor, his Talmud, conquers Yericho on Shabbos, he does it through dibur, like his master, Moshe. But that was an exceptional battle. That was most unusual. Abul Ba'ai, when it came to the battle against the city of Ai and the rest of the wars in Canaan, he needed to act, he needed to do an action. It had to be the sword, the spear, etc. Okay, how does that help us understand what Korach was getting at here? V'hinei behold, Torah's Moshe is keneged dibur. The Torah of Moshe is corresponding to his way of working was with dibur. He did everything by Hashem Yisbarach with dibur. But yesh lahislabshus, it vests itself through the midos, through the midos in the world of action as well. As hinted to in the Pasuk, Ani Rishon, Vani Achron. Hashem declares, Ani Rishon, Ani Achron, I am first, I am last. I can start with Machshava, with the thought going through Dibur, but it goes right through to Achron, right down to Maisa, right down to action as well. The power of Moshe Rabbeinu was not Chas v'Shalom limited to Dibur. The Dibur was able to bring things, the speech was able to bring things right down into action. V'hinei, and behold, Korach sees, however, that this generation was not going to enter the land of Israel. As the Ramban says, that was the signal for Korach to act. But why? Explains the Kedushas Levi, Lahoya Ma'amin Bozeh, Shetoras Moshe Yeslo Slavish Gamosir. He didn't believe that Moshe Rabbeinu had any practical implementation of his speech. It was all theory, theory, theory. And what's the best proof that it's all theoretical? And it's only speech, it's only words, and it's no action. And that's the fact is that when it comes to the nitty-gritty, when it comes to getting into the promised land, when it comes to V'hai Kiviyachal Aretz, they're never going to make it to the Aretz. You see, says Korach, Moshe Rabbeinu has misled you. He is a man of Dibur. You are in a generation of the Dor HaMidbar, Dor HaMedaber. But look, you're being all left behind because he cannot carry through into Asiyah, into action. It is this now that Hashem punishes midah keneged midah, measure for measure. And Hashem is going to demonstrate to Korach and to all the people of Israel that you think that Moshe Rabbeinu's mouth, his words, his only words, and doesn't come to action. But tiftach haaretz es piyah, you will see how down to earth, pun intended, is Moshe Rabbeinu. As he opens his mouth, the earth opens its mouth. The earth, which is the Olam HaAsiyah, the world of action, is to demonstrate that in the world of Asiyah, the world of action, in the most practical form, there is indeed a investing of Torah's Moshe as well. V'zehu, and this is the remez, says the Kedushas Levi. Ben Yitzhar, Korach takes the fact. Ben Yitzhar, he takes Behirus, means shining. Ben Kahas means unity, Achdus. V'lo Kasamim, to whom the nations. Ben Levi means his chabras, attachment. As it says, Hapam Yilabi Ishi, that's why she called him Levi. Now my husband will be attached to me. Why is all these words used? L'rame is to indicate Shekoirach lohoyo maimin rak bo'olam hadibur. Korach only believed in the world of speech. Sheyesh lo shlosh b'chinas has these three levels, but he never believed that he can get olam hasiyah, the world in action. The truth is, however, how wrong was he? Indeed, in the world of asiyah, in the world of action, they saw now the practical hislabshus, the investing of Moshe Rabbeinu's words. Ani Rishon, Vani Achron. I started and I'll end it. And this was the hard lesson that Korach and his people saw from the story of the earth opening up its mouth. What's the reaction of Moshe Rabbeinu? Well, Moshe Rabbeinu hears the complaint, and what does he do? Vayishma Moshe vayipol al panav. So we find that Moshe Rabbeinu listens and he falls upon his face. When you look at that pasuk, the first question that you ask yourself is, well, obviously he listened. He was there the whole time. The Torah tells us he's talking to them. What does it mean by Yishma? Rashi doesn't talk about this, but we will have a look soon at the Orach HaKodesh, who does question this. But why does he fall upon his face? That Rashi does explain. Vayipol al panav, he falls on his face, says Rashi, because of the machlokes. This is now the fourth time. There's an expression in English, in Hebrew, lahavdil, third time lucky, 3 times lucky. They sinned by the egel, the calf, and Moshe Rabbeinu could daven. They sinned by the misonim when they complained about the food, etc., and Moshe daven. They sinned by the meraglim and the spies, and Moshe daven. And Egypt will hear what you'll do to them, etc. In the machlokes of Korach, he felt his hands now tiring, getting weak. How can I now daven? How can I now plead? I've already done it. 3 times I've done it. 4th time, no. How can I do it? And Rashi brings the famous mashal, Leven Melech, to a son of a king who sins against his father. And his friend pleads on his behalf for the son once, twice, 3 times. But, that's it. By the 4th time, Nisrash Lidevaho, says Rashi, the 4th time, he already feels, I can't do it anymore. And he says, Ad Mosai, how much longer can I trouble the king? Maybe he's not going to accept it anymore from me. Ad Kan. That's what Rashi brings Natan Choma. As I said, Rashi doesn't really focus on the first three words, by Yishma Moshe, and Moshe heard. Well, obviously he heard. What do you need those words for? Let's have a look at the Orach. Says Orach HaKodesh Tzarech Ladas, we need to know why does it need to say Vayishma and he heard, after it already says Vayomru Aleim, and they spoke to them. Minayin Ya'ala Ladas, where would it ever occur to someone that he's not going to hear? Oid Tzarech Ladas, and the second thing we need to know is, as Rashi asked, what is this nefillah? What is this falling? And he fell. What did he do? What does it help to fall? And therefore, Venera, it appears that these malagliglim, these scoffers, hadn't finished what their complaint was all about. They haven't finished it. But the Pasuk tells us that Moshe not just heard, but understood what was behind that machlokes. He understood tachlis advarim. He knew what they're really getting at, even though they didn't complete their words. And therefore, he says, Vayipol, he fell upon his face, not just because of what they said, not just because of what he heard, but from what he understood. Neged masha omro shem isnasim al kal Hashem, because they're getting up against the goal of Hashem, shekloloi b'divrei Moshe v'Aaron, but they're also including Moshe and Aaron. In other words, what he feels and what he can sense is, this is not just a complaint about appointment of Elitzophan, the son of Uziel, as the leader of Levi, where I should be instead. I come from the older uncle. But this is a defiance against Moshe and Aaron himself. And there are 2 different reactions. One against Moshe and one a reaction to the rebellion against Aaron. That's how the Arachaim learns. Keneged Moshe Negela Moshe, corresponding in relation to what the complaint was. Moshe Rabbeinu being a king and taking the king position, for that he falls on his face. He shows his utmost humility. The Shiva Nafshe Kafaretz, he's like the dust of the land, like an Eved that humbly submits, like a servant that's Mishtachaveh Lifnei Sorah, that bows down before authority. He doesn't respond. He's falling upon his face. He doesn't answer that. Says the Racham HaKodesh, but the complaint against Aaron, Vayedaber el Korach. He lifts his voice in the command that Vayedaber only means. In the morning you will see. In other words, there's no way. You're going to watch and you're going to see it maybe the hard way, but you will see what happened if it's from me or if it's from Hashem. Says the Racham HaKodesh, what a difference in reaction. What an amazing difference. When you're talking about the complaint against Moshe Rabbeinu, as humble as you could imagine. Not a word. But when it comes to the complaint against Aaron, he stands up defiantly. Moshe Rabbeinu stands up defiantly. That's how he understands it. However, I'd like to tell another explanation, very similar to the Racham HaKodesh, that actually happened to the Alter Rebbe, and it's quoted in the Sefer of Rab Zevin. He says there was a story there where we find the Alter Rebbe, of course, had thousands and thousands of Chassidim, and there were people that were not very happy and not used to the idea of individuals commanding authority over others. So they were misnagdim. They couldn't understand the idea of a Rebbe. They got very upset. So one of them actually came to the Alter Rebbe, to the Balatana, and he said, "What is this business? Who are you to lord yourself over thousands of people? You've got a masharis, a person who stands by your door, and so on and so forth." When the Alter Rebbe heard this complaint, he bent his head over his arms on the table, and he went into almost like tachanun, like a trance, and he was like that for quite some time. Then he lifts himself up and he responds to this complainer, to this non-chassid, and he says, "You know, there is a pasuk that says, Roshei Alfei Yisrael, the heads of thousands of Yidden." He says, the Torah calls Gedolei Yisrael heads, Roshim. Why? He says, because just like in the human body, there is a head, there is a body, there are arms, there are legs. And each part needs to serve a different function. A different clothes, a different garments are put on different parts of the body. You can't dress every part of the body with the same garments. In the same way, the leaders of the Bnei Yisrael are given certain duties, are given certain garments. And the Rosh Bnei Yisrael that Hashem has chosen are all wear different garments, and that's where Hashem made it. The man who asked this question seemed to be rather satisfied with the answer, but the son of the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, was not completely satisfied, and he says, Tata, he says, to answer such a question and to give such a fairly simple answer, why did you have to go into that great state of meditation of his bonus? It's a fairly straightforward answer. The Alter Rebbe responded and he said, when Korach came out with this statement, the whole community are holy, who needs a leader, who needs a Rebbe, etc., etc. Why do you lord yourself over the Kal Hashem? He says, Vayishma Moshe, the Pasuk says, Vayipal alponav. Moshe heard and he fell upon his face. He too went into his bonus. So why couldn't Moshe straight away open his mouth and start talking? He had to go, Vayishma alponav. Explain the Alter Rebbe, Moshe Rabbeinu Alav Shalom, when he hears that they're asking and complaining about Madua Tisnasu, he thinks, I have to make a cheshbon hanefesh. I have to make a soul searching. Maybe it's true. Maybe I have some sort of ego that I want to be leader. That desire. And it's only after Moshe Rabbeinu was down on his face and he went through this absolute cheshbon hanefesh and was confident that there was not a hint, not a shemetz, no trace of any ego, etc., Then he was able to lift himself up and answer. The Alter Rebbe says, I did the same thing. I went into my same isbonenus, and I wanted to think to see whether there was any shred, whether there's any thoughts, if you like, that I had my self-interest involved. And after I was satisfied, then I gave that answer. Finally, let's have a look on the last page there. As the Jewish people then see the amazing miracle of the stick of Aaron blossoming, after the witnessing the terrible plague, the Magaifa that engulfs many more people than in the story of the earth opening up, we read about the Jewish people in exasperation turning to Moshe and saying the following words. Vayomru b'nei Yisrael al Moshe lemor, and the children of Israel said to Moshe, saying, Hein govanu avadnu kolon avadnu. We're dead. We're finished. There's no hope. What's their complaint? Kol hakorev korev el mishkan Hashem yomos. Whoever comes closer to the Mishkan of God will die. Will we ever stop dying? Ha'im tamnu ligvaya. Explains Rashi, what was their complaint? Their complaint was as follows. We cannot be so careful. We're all able to go right up to the chotzer, right up to the yard of the Chol Moed. And yet, if we step one step further, we go into the Chol Moed, into the tent, into the Mishkan, we could die. It's too dangerous. How can we survive this? Haim tamnu ligvaya. Will we ever stop dying? Shemahu fkarnu lemisa. Are we hefker? Are we just let loose to die? How can we do that? That's the simple pshat according to Rashi. There is a famous pshat from the Tiferes Shlomo, from the Domsker Rebbe, on these words, ha'im tamnu ligvoya, which is as follows. Kol hakorev hakorev, whoever comes close to the Mishkan Hashem, will we ever stop dying? The word tamnu literally means stop, from the word tam b'nishlam. But in the Tiferes Shlomo, he brings a word from his Rebbe, who was Rabbi Shaya from Preshbords, who said, before he separated, he left company, he said as follows, Ha'im tamnu ligvoya, not will we finish dying, but am tamnu, are we perfect to die? The word tamnu coming from the root tamim. Have we reached the milas hashlemus? Have we reached the ultimate perfection that a man needs to reach b'chayov in his life? Oz, then we are indeed, we are chas v'shalom, we could leave this world. But the Rabbi Mechaber continues, he says, Chazdei Hashem kiloi samno, normally translated as the kindness of God is that it doesn't finish. But he says, with a little twist on that, Chazdei Hashem, the kindness of God is kiloi samno, that we are not yet perfect. The chesed that Hashem gives us is that we are not perfect, and therefore we can live more to complete our mission on earth. According to Tiferes Shlomo, therefore, on a deeper level, what they were saying was, Haim tamnu ligvoya, not will we ever finish dying, but are we perfect to die? And in relation to that, I'd like to tell a story that you may have heard, but it's a geschmacka story anyway, that Reb Zevin brings in connection with this part of the Tiferes Shlomo of the Radomsker Rebbe that happened with the Avnei Nezer, Rabbi Avram Sachashava of Sachashava, Rabbi Bornstein, when he was a very young boy. And the story goes as follows. When the Ram Sachashav was a very young man, he was very sick. And his father, the Rav Abayala, came to the great Kotzker Rebbe, the Mendel of Kotzk. And he said, Rebbe, he says, can you give my son a refuah shlema? He's very, very sick, but his nefesh is so bonded with Torah, it's unbelievable. He never stops learning. He's mamash a masbid nifla. And the Rebbe of Kotzk answered and said, oich mir gelernt. In other words, I could learn as well. I suppose we can call that learning. The father was shocked to hear the response from the Kotzker Rebbe. It seemed rather strange. He was looking to recount the schus of his son, amazing learning, amazing person, and all the Rebbe can answer is as if it's garnished. When he came home, he saw that his son was already healthy. It was mamish like a nest. Mamish, the tzaddik goes HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim. But the son wanted to know from his father, was hat the Rebbe gesagt? What did he say? What did the Rebbe say? And the father did not want to say. And the son pleaded with him. He says, tell me, Tati, tell me, what did he say? What did he say? The son didn't want to, the father didn't want to say. Finally, the son said, tell me what he says, maybe I'll understand. So the father told him exactly the reaction and how the father had dismissed, as if to say, in other words, big deal. The son was a genius, the Avnei Nezer, turned to his father and says, Tate, ich verstehe, I understand what the Rebbe was saying. He says, what's pshat? So I'll tell you. And then the son told the father the story that is recorded in the Yerushalmi Peah, Perek Aleph. The Yerushalmi Peah brings a story about Rabbi Tarfon being very sick. And the Chachamim came to visit him. And the mother of Rabbi Tarfon turned to the scholars, turned to the Chachamim and said, Hispalalu al Tarfon bini, daven for Tarfon, my son. Shehu noyeg be covered yoser midai. His covered for me is extraordinary. So they asked her, what does he do for you? So she described how one time she wanted to walk in the Chotzer in Shabbos, on the Shabbos. She wanted to go down. Rabbi Tarfon cupped his hands under her feet, and she would walk on his feet, walk on his hands until she would reach the Chotzer, so she didn't dirty his feet. The Chachamim responded in the following fashion. The Yerushalmi Peah says, even if your son would do 1,000 times as much, he wouldn't reach half the level of kibud aim that the Torah demands. And the son then turned to the father and says, Tata, let me ask you, the Chachamim are coming to minimize the zchus of the Rabbi Tarfon. She's trying to magdil, trying to plead on behalf of her son. He needs a refuah shlema. And all they can do is say, God, even if you do 1,000 times as much, you'd only reach half the level of kibbud aim. What are they doing? So the son explained to his father that what their kavanah was, that they were worried that after she had said that my son's level of kibbud aim is so extraordinary, well, maybe he had reached a level of perfection. Maybe his avoid in this world had come to a level of, tamnu. We've done everything. And chas v'shalom, that could be not a help for his neshama, but in fact the opposite. So therefore they said, you think he's already done his job, he's done his mission. He's got so much more to do, he's got so much more in life to do, this azoiful sultan. So they minimized the schus. So he says, so the little Avremela, the Avnei Nezer turned to his father and says, that's what the Rebbe was doing. You kept on singing my praises, talking about how the world stands on my learning. I don't know, my mother. He says the Rebbe wanted to push away any ein hora by that. He wanted to say, no, there'll be plenty more to do. In other words, don't start talking so much about your learning. He's got so much more to accomplish. And that actually helped me. And that brought me the refuah shlema. The father was amazed by the genius words of his son. And he turned, next time he was in Kotsk, he went to the Rebbe, the Mental Kotsk, and he asked the Rebbe, he says, is that the pshat in your words? And the Rebbe says, the child already understands my kavunas. I want to finish off now by saying that Efsher Loima, perhaps we can say that in a similar way, we know that so many times when people would bring reports to our Rebbe about the accomplishments of what they did, about the money that they raised, about the moistus that they built, about the amount of people coming to different shurim, etc., etc. The Rebbe would always say, no, double it, no, triple it. The Rebbe was never satisfied. Now we know he was never satisfied. That was always the case. I don't know why, we don't know why. But maybe there's a little bit of a hint in that idea, as if to say, you haven't finished anything. The Rebbe is telling you you've got so much more to accomplish. That itself gives a lease of chayes, gives a lease of life, and gives the energy. And the Eretz Hashem, the Eibusher shall help. Chazdei avai ki lo samnu. The chazda of Hashem is that we are not perfect, and that we've got so much more to accomplish. Eibusher shall bless everyone. It should be a chodesh of Geula, a chodesh of Yeshua, and a chodesh of Nechama with Mashiach Tzidkei. Thanks for listening.